Welcome back to It Is Also Written Ministry, Part 3 of the Prophetic Clock. Now you recall, as we had ended the last time in Part 2, identifying the message by Enoch to the antediluvian world brought to the surface that which was in their hearts. They were expecting the Lord to come as a result of the prophets speaking and identifying the time that they were living in, as it was generally expected that the Lord would come at that particular time, and as Enoch had not been given the light as to the manner of Jesus' coming, he proclaimed his message in perfect harmony with the popular view of that generation. So now Part 3, we have to ask the question, what made them reject the message so long as its proclamation was in harmony with their expectation and they could not refute its truth? The question can be answered by the experience of John the Baptist. Now, John did not fully understand the nature of the Messiah's kingdom. He looked for Israel to be delivered, as many of those who lived during his day, from her national foes. But the coming of the king in righteousness and the establishment of Israel as a holy nation was the great object of his hope, along with many others. It would have been unreasonable and injustice to the chosen people of God if he should have left them in darkness concerning the time of the most important event of all church history, the coming of Christ. That part of the long prophetic period of the 2300-day year prophecy of Daniel 8:14, which pertained to the Jewish nation, namely the 70 weeks or the 490 years, they perfectly understood, for it was well known that the 70 weeks of Daniel's prophecy covering the Messiah's advent were nearly ended, and all were eager to share in that era of national glory which was then expected. Now light had been shining to the Jewish nation, and they were all well informed of him, to whom they had expended millions of dollars in sacrifices and hundreds of years in ceremonial services, the time he should come and the nature of his kingdom. So as the rulers of the nation had fallen under sin, they despised the correction by the prophets. Thus the character of the then expected kingdom was misinterpreted, but the time they rightly understood and nationally accepted. As John had not been given light on what was to transpire after the Anointed One should come, he proclaimed the message in perfect harmony with the popular idea of the prophetic time and of the coming kingdom. Now, since there was no controversy between the teaching of John the Baptist and the rulers of Israel, we come to our question, what made them reject his message? In the natural order of things, John, the son of Zechariah, should have been educated for the priesthood, but the training of the rabbinical schools would have unfitted him for his work. God did not send him to the teachers of theology to learn how to interpret the scriptures. He called him from the desert that he might learn of nature and nature's God. So it was a lonely region where John found his home, and in the midst of barren hills, wild ravens, and rocky caves. But it was his choice to forego the enjoyments and luxuries of life for the stern disciplines of the wilderness. As the scribes and Pharisees said of Christ and of the apostles, "We will not have these ignorant men reign over us." They poured the same accusations against John, and this was the undermining of their eternal welfare. Their second stumbling block came as John's singular appearance carried the minds of his hearers back to the ancient seers. In his manner of dress, he resembled the prophet Elijah. With the spirit and the power of Elijah, he denounced the national corruption and rebuked the prevailing sins. As a symbol of cleansing from sin, he baptized them in the water of Jordan. Thus, by a significant object lesson, John declared that those who claimed to be the chosen people of God were defiled by sin, and that without purification of heart and life, they would have no part in the Messiah's kingdom. John declared to the teachers of Israel that their pride, selfishness, and cruelty showed them to be a generation of vipers, a deadly curse to the people, rather than the children of just and obedient Abraham. Thus the forerunner of Christ did, for he saw his people deceived, self-satisfied, and asleep in their sins. He longed to rouse them to a holier life. God does not send a messenger to flatter the sinner. He delivers no message of peace to lull the unsanctified into fatal security. Because John warned his people of the danger and the doom of his nation, they hated him the more. Now, what made the antediluvian world reject the message by Enoch? Enoch's message to the old world was in like manner in perfect harmony with the popular acceptance of the coming of the Lord. But as his work carried the same rebuke as that of John the Baptist, by turning from the message of salvation that was to blot out their sins, Enoch's prophecy of the judgment, they placed themselves under greater condemnation By rejecting the only means for their salvation, they cut themselves loose from the power that upholds all things, and thereby invited the terrible flood. God, not willing that any should perish, commanded Noah to declare the danger beforehand and provide means and facilities for those who wish to escape the ruin. But as they turned down the message by Enoch, they did likewise with the message by Noah. As these messages were inspired by the Holy Spirit, they sinned against him. Therefore, it shall never be forgiven them. Thus, the message by William Miller was a fulfillment of Enoch's prophecy, also a duplicate. If this is correct, there must be a perfect comparison of one with the other. As Enoch did not fully understand the manner of the coming of the Lord, and John the Baptist, the character of the kingdom that was to be set up, just so Miller misinterpreted the cleansing of the sanctuary and proclaimed the coming of the Lord to earth instead of into the most holy place. If some should charge Miller with being a false prophet, they may likewise accuse Enoch and John. Such blind and hasty conclusions is an attempt to overthrow the whole Bible. Now the question arises, why did God allow his servants to remain in darkness as to what was to transpire at the end of their message? Well, there's several reasons for this. Enoch's and Miller's message was similar to the forerunner to the first advent of Christ. John's message was to prepare the way of the Lord's coming and not to explain the nature of his kingdom. So it was with Miller and Enoch. The second reason, had John been given light that Christ's kingdom was not of this world, it would have brought about extreme internal friction with his nation. Therefore, such a debatable question would have overthrown his work and rendered useless the message for his people. But as there was no argument as to what he taught his hearers, it left the sin-blinded leaders of Israel without an excuse. Had they accepted his message and repented of their sins, it would have opened their spiritual eyesight, and the arrival of the Anointed One would have enlightened the rest of the way. In Miller's time, Christendom was no less ignorant of the sanctuary question than the Jewish nation was of Christ's kingdom. Therefore, had Miller been given light concerning the place to which Christ was to come at the end of the 2300 days, namely to the most holy place for the judgment of the saints, his message would have brought forth many arguments and idle discussions. Thus, the time and the proclamation of the prophetic period would have been neglected and his efforts frustrated. But in the manner he proclaimed his message, he gave them no occasion for dispute, and the enemies of God could not contradict his interpretation of the Scriptures and refuse to be interested in what he taught. It left them without excuse. Thus, the second angel's message of Revelation 14, verse 8, was proclaimed immediately after the disappointment, saying, "Babylon is fallen. That is, the world in 1844 fell in the same manner as the one before the flood. The present world is called Babylon because the kingdom of Babylon is the immediate one after the flood. Thus Babylon became the mother of all nations." Our world stands at this present time in the same place as the one before the flood. The old world was condemned by rejecting the message in its type and the new in the antitype. Note how remarkable the coincidences. After the proclamation of the good news, the glad news, the coming of the Lord by Enoch was flatly ignored by the old world and the preparation neglected. Noah declared the end of the world in his generation. The message by Miller was followed by identically the same declaration as that of Noah, as it was announced after 1844, that is, the end of the world in this generation. As it was understood that Christ was to come to earth on the expected date, and the teaching remained uncontradicted that the return of the long-expected Son of God was at hand, it should have been profoundly interesting to those who claim the name of Christ as their only Savior and Redeemer. If their praise which they proclaimed with their lips were also in their hearts, they would have gladly expected the good news and made all possible preparation for the most glorious event in all of history. But as they refused to be interested, they ridiculed and flatly rejected it all, showing their true character and thus marking themselves as goats. Since the most exalted and promising news of celestial glory was rejected, and the messenger unappreciated in both cases, the old and the modern worlds, it is positive that whatever truth is presented, regardless of its magnitude of glory, these scoffers of today will not believe, and will thus bring condemnation upon themselves. As God declared the danger of the old world by the preaching of Noah in one generation, just so has he forewarned the world of its end in this generation. As provision was made before the flood for those who wish to escape the ruin, Just so, he has provided means and facilities for all who wish to evade the doom that confronts our world. Not to enter into the ark built by the hands of men, no. That was only a figure, but into many mansions prepared by the Lord himself. Not into the ark floating over mad waters, but into the mansions resting on foundations of precious stones. The dreaded flood is a type of the dark millennium. As God's faithful people were saved then, so shall they be saved now. But the sinner now shall perish as the sinner then. So as we see, both calls lining up on the vertical alignment at the 6th hour, that would be Enoch's call during the nighttime, and Miller during the day, reflect present truth or prophetic truth on the prophetic time clock. Now, reiterating the dynamic connections or ties between the night calls and the day calls. Now, take a look at the first man that sinned, which is called the first Adam. Now, look at the clock dial. From the 3rd hour in the dark part, that is the fall of Adam, opposite to the 3rd hour in the light part, and we see the 2nd Adam, that is Christ crucified. Again now, look at the 6th hour in the dark part of the clock dial, Enoch prophesying of the coming of Christ, opposite to the 6th hour of the light part, and there we see Miller also prophesying of the same event, the coming of Christ. This is one of the reasons why God allowed Miller, as we've mentioned, to proclaim the coming of Christ in 1844. Now, moving on, look at the 9th hour. Noah predicting the end of the world in his generation. And opposite to the 9th hour, in the light part, we see Ellen G. White prophesying of the end of the world in this generation. And that is where this generation began. And at the 12th hour, notice, Israel, after the flesh, going out of Egypt, when the sun rises, is opposite of the 12th hour sunset. And we see Israel after the spirit, not the flesh, but after the spirit now, the finished product going out of the world, Egypt. Therefore, there's no question but what the fall of Adam and the prophecy of Enoch and Noah came at the hours as shown on the chart. So we see that the night and the day messages are connected, bringing prophetic light on the prophetic time clock. Now don't miss this, because here we see another type. God's truth to the world before the Bible actually came into existence. It coincides with his truth in the time of the Bible, showing that God has but one truth, one Christ, and one gospel in all the ages. The 12th hour on the dial to the left represents sunrise and the right sunset. The 6th hour in the light part, noon, and the 6th in the dark part, midnight. So the message at the 6th hour by Miller is called the midnight cry, as we've mentioned before, because it corresponds with that of Enoch. Said Jesus, "At the midnight there was a cry made, Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him." The 6th hour in the light part stands also as noon, when the sun is in full strength, and the Bible began to rise at the 12th hour when the message by Miller was preached, represented by the 6th hour call. Both the Old and New Testament had been compiled and published, thus it also denotes midday. So the message proclaimed by Enoch was a prophecy looking forward to 1844, when Jesus came into the most holy place with his saints for the investigative judgment. Therefore, the preaching by Miller was a fulfillment of the prophecy by Enoch, thus it is called the midnight cry. As the subject of the judgment was not to be understood until after its session had commenced, it was impossible for Miller to make the proper application for the then expected event. Though it is the crowning work of our salvation and the setting up of the kingdom of Christ upon earth, yet the investigative judgment is one of the least understood and most mystified and confused Bible subjects of all the ages. Were it not essential to our salvation, the enemy would not have expended every possible effort to envelop it in darkness. Imperative then is the unremitting need to search the scriptures as for hidden treasures, and to beseech God for the guidance of his Spirit in order to rightly understand this all-important subject called the investigative judgment. In vain, though, any search for truth, unless the motive be to learn and to do the will of God. Hence, if any man, says Jesus, will do his will, he will know of the doctrines whether it be of God. Since the subject of the judgment is taught in types and parables, and since the Lord explains that his teaching parabolically is so that only his disciples may know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, obviously, therefore, none but his followers can understand the whole truth.